Hello and welcome to the Deviant's world. I am here with Andrew Gelwicks, a New York City and Los Angeles-based celebrity fashion stylist, writer, and speaker. Andrew began his career in the fashion department at GQ magazine and later worked at Teen Vogue. He's been featured internationally in the New York Times and several other publications, and his new book, The Queer Advantage: Conversations with LGBTQ+ Leaders on the Power of Identity, is out today. Happy Pub Day, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's still surreal to see someone else holding the book.
I know that
feel
feeling.
like it's always just been me, and now it's it's like I love it.
I know, especially when I don't know about you, but I'm like, I love feeling like covers of books, and like especially what goes into like the texture and everything. It's a very soft, velvety book, which we tried to accomplish too, but then we found out that like if you touched it, the black velvety stuff gets these horrible fingerprints, so they had to like change it. So but I will say yours is velvety and doesn't get fingerprints, so congratulations once again. And so you talk about in your preface to 51 interviews that you conducted, which is remarkable, and we'll get into that. But for people who don't know you, and you do such a great job of introducing yourself and your story and these interviews, but I'd love to hear, you mention growing up in a conservative part of Ohio, which of course is in the news quite a bit recently with the election coming up and the swing state status that it has. So I'm curious what that was like growing up, you know, as a gay future fashion stylist in conservative Ohio. As a Texan, I have a feeling we have similar experiences.
Yeah, I mean, it's first of all, I never in a million years growing up thought I would ever be doing what I'm doing now. First of all, I didn't know it existed. Second of all, if I had known being a celebrity fashion stylist existed, I certainly would not have thought that would be an avenue for me. But I mean, I'm similar to what I am assuming you grew up with in Texas. It was just an overwhelming sense of I do not see anyone that I feel a connection and resonance with. And it was super challenging to try and find yourself in a place where there was nothing that really connected. And so I really had to look elsewhere and to really try that much harder to find out who I was and what I wanted to be and what my life could look like. And we explore a lot of that in the Queer Advantage, talking with these leaders about how they too, most of them did not grow up in a New York City or Los Angeles, and they had to look elsewhere to see where they could live their best, most fulfilling life.
And you mentioned, you know, going to school as, you know, as we all do as young gay kids trying to identify themselves. And it's not always the easiest. And what I think was so interesting that you talk about in your introduction is how you actually went to, it was Salt Lake City, I believe, right? For basically a program. And, you know, usually when you hear about Mormonism or you hear about faith-based kind of conversion camps, you hear really negative experiences. But I'm curious, you know, you had a really good experience. So what did that teach you about yourself, but also faith? And you know, what did you learn out of that experience?
So first and foremost, it wasn't a conversion camp. Right. It wasn't conversion therapy. It wasn't based on religion. It was really just happened to be in Salt Lake City. But that being said, you know, the growing up in Ohio and trying to figure out myself was incredibly painful. And for me, that led to severe depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation. And that's when we decided, my family and my therapy team, to do something more drastic and more intensive. And that's why I went to Salt Lake City. But it was a treatment center. It was a therapeutic environment. It wasn't based on religion or trying to convert us in any ways. It was me and about 16, 17 other teenage boys who were struggling. And we were all dealing with a variety of issues. Some of them I came to learn were also struggling with their sexual orientation and trying to not only accept it, but understand it. And that's what happened in Salt Lake City. That was a place and a time where I could leave my surroundings, leave kind of what I had grown up with, and just focus on who I wanted to become and how I could make that happen. So it was really just a time and place of learning to love myself instead of trying to change myself.
Right. Yeah, and I was struck by it because just a week or two ago, I did an event with Garrett Conley, who was the author of the memoir Boy Erased, which of course turned into the great film, which shows kind of the dark side of some of these conversion therapy programs. But then I think what your experience is so interesting because it shows that there are programs that exist to help you find yourself and accept yourself, and find help that are actually doing good. And just because your family wants to help you, right, it doesn't mean that whatever institute or program you go to has to be a negative experience. There exist these really inclusive, empowering programs as well.
Absolutely. And I think that's so crucial to understand. Every time I tell someone I went to Salt Lake City, they're like horror stricken. They're like, oh my God, you went to one of those places? I'm like, no. Like, I'm telling you, like, this was the most welcoming, nourishing, and encouraging environment. And, for me, having grown up most of my friends and family are all Jewish, and this was like a whole other kind of orbit for me, but they were so from my perspective, religion wasn't even a question here. It was, Andrew, how are you going to live with yourself and love yourself and move forward? And I think that's what's so amazing. And I've heard horrible soul crushing stories about other programs and treatments, and I think that's a whole other issue and problem. But I find myself incredibly lucky that the program I was in was truly life-saving.
Right. And it's amazing that these programs exist, because I think there is so much focus on the negative ones that we don't give proper due to the ones that are so important and helpful. And I love that you mentioned that you come back to high school and you, I believe, start like your Queer Students Association, and you have this amazing story about how you recruited the star quarterback. Could you talk about what happened? How did he get involved, and what did that teach you kind of going forward?
Yeah, I came back from Salt Lake City. I re-entered my high school for senior year, and I had come out to my parents. I'd come out at the facility that I was at, and I was just thinking to myself, I'm doing this. I've learned how to love myself. I'm gonna just go out and be myself. So I started the Gay Straight Alliance in my high school, which if you had told me 6 months before that I would be doing that, I would have laughed in your face. But I realized that I wanted it to be something that wasn't just for queer students, but hopefully bring in others as well. And frankly, I needed some social capital to help me with that. And I was thinking, who would have that power? And the first thing that comes to mind is the star quarterback of the football team. And he's he's dating one of my girlfriends at the time, and he, is the epitome of Midwestern high school quarterback footballer. Clearly I'm not a big sports person. But I think I literally just texted him. I was like, hey, I'm doing this. I know this probably isn't at the top of your list, but I think it would mean so much. And I would love to discuss this further with you. And he said yes immediately. And I think that was my first experience of allyship at its truest form. He, as far as I know, he may have like barely considered how this could affect him. It was just, I'm going to do this and I'm going to put myself out there and support this group. And it was, amazing. I'm still so grateful to him.
And I think it goes to show, I mean, this was probably 10, 15 years ago. And, things have gotten even better since then. And, I'm in Los Angeles and you're in New York. And I think we write off so many, or you see other people writing off towns like mine. I grew up in a town called Round Rock, Texas, right? You grew up in Ohio, and people write off, oh, these are the, people who will always be watching Fox News and never accept us. But there are these pockets of hope that exist even back then. And you talk about, going to college and finding community, and also in New York, building that community. And I get so many questions from people who ask, how do I, if I'm newly out of the closet or I move to a new town, especially now in a pandemic when gay spaces don't really exist other than online, how did you find community kind of from the ground up?
I was very lucky in that I was able to find it and, dive headfirst into it fairly quickly. I definitely used like social media to find queer people, but also it seemed like everybody who I knew that knew a queer person wanted to like introduce me to them, as if like just because we're gay we'd automatically be best friends.
Yes.
Which, at the time I was like, yes, please, because I want to meet more people. But honestly, that really just kind of spiraled into just building a network. And I think, or I don't say network, a community. And as I talk in the book, I think that's one of the most special things about being queer, is that you have this incredibly supportive community around you. And I was welcomed in first thing, and I talk about being at a Central Park picnic, and I still think about it because it was a bunch of older young professionals. I think just coming out my freshman year of college, and they could not have been more excited and interested in helping me find other people and meet new people and talk about careers. And I had never experienced that before. And these were guys who I had known for 10 minutes. And for me, that was just so remarkable. And I still see that a lot today in queer relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. And your story about the star quarterback, it just made me realize as you were talking, something very similar happened at Columbia University. The very first LGBT student organization was founded in New York at Columbia, and one of the rules that was preventing people from joining this club is that you had to disclose your membership list. And so all the gay students, these queer, undergrads, were worried to put their name down because they were worried they'd get expelled, they would get, persecuted. And so what they did is came up with this genius idea of going to all the straight student athletes and student leaders and having them join the group, so no one knew who exactly was queer. So it just goes to show this idea of solidarity is something that we still need to be fighting for. And you were able to find that community in New York on your own as well. And so that brings us to the title of your book, which is The Queer Advantage. So what is, you talk about it in the book, but for people who don't know, what is the queer advantage? What does that mean?
Well, first of all, I love that story about Columbia. I had never heard about that. I think that's the most incredible thing ever. I need to look more into that.
Yes.
But, the queer advantage, and what I love about it is that it's different for every single person. It's really talking about how the experience of growing up queer, of being queer, how that allows for just extra potential and advantages and skills and resources. And, I ask each person in the book, how has being queer advantaged you? And every person has a different answer. And to me, that's the coolest thing, because I could have my own queer advantages, you can have your own queer advantages, but everyone else could have their own as well. Mm-hmm. And I think being able to discover that and even just explore others as well and kind of think how that's applicable to you is so energizing and interesting. And, I think I went into writing it thinking that there'd be, a queer advantage is wanting to prove yourself and extra ambition and drive. But it just felt like every time I spoke with someone, there was something new that was being uncovered that I never necessarily thought of. Mm-hmm. And I still get that when I look through the pages now. And it's kind of when you see a movie and you watch it the second time, and you're like, how did I miss that? You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, whoa, that's kind of how I'm getting almost. And that, to me, that's the most exciting thing.
Mm-hmm. And you write, was being queer my edge? Could my difference and all the earlier negative energy associated with it have been a good thing? Perhaps the best thing that ever happened to me, which I think is such a powerful line. And it reminded me of just 2 days ago was National Coming Out Day. And the subject of my book, Dr. Frank Kameny, invented this phrase, gay is good, right? Because it's not, everyone up until that point had been trying to say, if you're gay or queer, you're just as good as straight people. And he says that's not enough. We need to see that this is actually something that's adding positively to society. It's not just us being as normal as other people, but us having a tangible good. And so I'm so curious, because you talked to 51 different people, and I know how much work goes into interviewing and transcribing and editing. It's a lot of work. So I'm wondering what compelled you, what gave you the idea to start this project?
Because I never thought it could be good. I never thought being gay could be remotely positive. And when I realized how wrong I was, and I wanted to learn more about that. Mm-hmm. I wanted to see whether other people thought that as well. Was I alone in this thinking, or, did other people, specifically some of the world's most successful leaders, find that they too have been advantaged and given a gift with their queer identity? And as we were saying earlier, my background is in fashion and New York, and those are such queer industries, places, and I love that. But at the same time, queer people are everywhere. We're in sports, politics, tech, finance. You literally cannot go to an industry and not find a queer person, which I think is so cool. And I think at the same time, I never really hear about a lot of those other queer people who are dominating in totally non-queer friendly places sometimes, and wanting to talk to those people and hear about their experience, and is the queer advantage an advantage in those spaces as well? And it 100% is, and I think that's the coolest thing. And wanting to highlight people of all different ages, races, identities, backgrounds, to get a full 360 perspective.
Mm-hmm. And you really do achieve so much diversity and breadth of the queer experience. I mean, just looking at this list, you go from Shangela to Jim Obergefell to Our Lady Jade, Adam Eli, my friend, so many different people who you profile. So I won't ask you, I warned you up front, I won't ask you to name your favorite, because I believe, is everyone still alive? I'm guessing, right? These are all people who are still. So I would never, I can't even imagine having 51 children to choose your favorite. But I'm curious, who was your first? Who was the first person you interviewed?
So I don't know if he actually knows this. Jonathan Mildenhall was the first person I interviewed, and I will forever be indebted to Jonathan for. And
for people who don't know him, who is Jonathan?
Jonathan Mildenhall is one of the most brilliant, creative marketing experts working today. He was the CMO of Airbnb. He has his own company now, 21st Century Brand. and he was at Coca-Cola and all these iconic brands, and some of the biggest campaigns that we would talk about now are likely by him. And so he was the first person I interviewed, and I remember I was so nervous because, again, I don't have a background in journalism. Yep. I haven't been interviewing people. But he could not have been more welcoming and kind. And I love his story because he talks about growing up poor in London, Black, and I think he said he was really the only Black person in his entire community and queer. And he says, like, that's a whole lot of other. And he talks about how really that's been so incredible, which I love. And I love hearing about people loving and embracing their full, unique, authentic identity. And that was, Jonathan was the first one. So I feel like really just like was like the rocket launch to take us off here. And yeah, he was the first for sure.
That's amazing. And honestly, I think, one piece of advice I give people is, if you don't really know what you want to do with your life, or you don't know the next step, is to look at what other people have done and look at how they've balanced, their identity and their career, and the adversity they faced and how they overcame it and how they chose to do what they do. And that's the best piece of advice you can ever give yourself, is to study others. And I do it all the time, what do other, queer historians or other historians or other, public intellectuals do? And it's such a great model. And this is really a textbook for seeing how other queer folks who are so talented and so successful, how they've been able to do it all. So then I asked about your first. I'm curious, who is the last person you interviewed, most recent?
Yeah. So you have to keep in mind, I finished this during COVID.
Wow.
So the last interview, I was completed in my childhood bedroom in Cincinnati, Ohio, over, I guess the phone, with Lee Daniels.
Oh, amazing.
One of my all-time favorite directors, producers, and he was like, when I first started this book, I sat down and created a list of goals, like who in my ideal fantasy life would I be speaking with, and he was absolutely on that list. And so it was super special to end it with him, and I'm super grateful for him. And I think he's such an inspiration and such a powerhouse, and I love how he is just so unapologetic in going after what he wants and taking on projects that are different. And I'm so inspired by him, honestly, that I'm so glad he was in there, and it's crazy that he finished it up.
That's amazing. And I recently saw news that he optioned a forthcoming book about Washington, D.C.'s first drag queen, who was formerly an enslaved person and really rejuvenated or brought drag to America. And so I'm so thrilled, not just for the book, which is coming out from another LA-based historian, but also for that project. I'm pseudo obsessed with it. So there are many others.
No one else would do that. No one else would do that, and that's the coolest thing. Like, go Lee. Like, I'm obsessed.
Amen.
Obsessed.
Amen. And there are 49 others in there to learn about from all different sectors of humanity and industry. And it is just such an incredible book. And so my last question is, you've shared this with the world. The book is out today, and I know the feeling of being asked this question when it's not ready. So it's okay if you don't know. But what's next? What do you have another book in mind? What is next in your life?
Next up, I definitely have another book in mind that I've started, and I think just kind of how this book was a little bit unexpected for me. The next one might be as well, but that's honestly what I find most exciting, is kind of delving into something totally out of my comfort zone and territory. Yep. And I'm excited to see where it goes.
That is so exciting. Well, everyone, go buy it today. It is the pub week for Andrew, for the Queer Advantage, conversations with LGBTQ plus leaders on the power of identity. It is out today. Go buy it. The first week of sales is by far the most important. Andrew, thank you so much for not just for joining us, but for doing the work and sharing these inspirational stories with us all.
Thank you, Eric. So much fun. Love you. Love your book. And this was awesome.
Bye, everyone. See you next week.